Leonardo grew up outside Florence, in the countryside, in a little village, Vinci. His mother was a peasant woman, he himself was illegitimate, but his father was a very respectable notary who married and had a legitimate family, into which Leonardo was to some extent absorbed. So there was no question of him being disowned, and his career was supported, even if it wasn't necessarily going to be a reiteration of his father's career. And what we've seen quite often in Italian Renaissance history is that illegitimate sons have a kind of ambition that takes them to the fore.
Renaissance Italy is very extraordinary. There is this intellectual driving force because more than any other country, they felt the weight or the tradition of classical antiquity. Rome was around them. And you combine that with early capitalist economies on a small scale, but very dynamic. You had the city-states like Venice and so on, which had major artists, but Florence is extraordinary. In the early 1500s, you had this astonishing flowering of Brunelleschi, the architect, Donatello, the sculptor, Masaccio, the painter, and a host of others. Art was becoming, in Florence, an intellectual pursuit.
Florence was an intensely mercantile city. It was a city of transactions, and even the great Medici had banking interests that spread across Europe. But they also wanted to show that they were culturally sophisticated and that they were using their wealth for the benefit of the city, for the benefit of their own souls when they were commissioning religious works of art. So what you've got is this lovely melting pot of factions and families in competition, and painters who might serve one or other of them, and who were also themselves looking over their shoulder all the time for what the latest innovation was.
Leonardo's father one day took some of his son's drawings to the artist Andrea del Verrocchio, who was a good friend of his, and directly asked him what he thought. Andrea was astonished by what he saw and arranged that Leonardo should enter his workshop. Giorgio Vasari, painter and historian.
This is the Tobias and the Angel from the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio, a painting from the early to mid-1470s. It's an apocryphal story in which the Archangel Raphael comes to young Tobias and instructs him to take parts of the fish, the gall and the liver and the heart, I believe, as a remedy to cure the blindness of his father. It raises some very interesting questions about how workshops worked and indeed how Leonardo functioned within the Verrocchio workshop. Verrocchio was one of the preeminent workshops. Many very important painters passed through the Verrocchio studio in the 1460s and 70s. I think one of the appeals of working with Andrea del Verrocchio for someone like Leonardo is the fact that this was, like many of these Florentine workshops, a production center for all manner of objects, both two-dimensional, three-dimensional. There was drawing, there was painting, there was casting, there was carving, and of course the multiplicity of interests that Leonardo demonstrated in his subsequent career certainly has some resonance with what went on in the Verrocchio studio. Where this painting in particular is involved, I think it's raised some very interesting ideas about collaboration and delegation, suggesting that some of the details of this picture might have been by the young Leonardo as an apprentice. We know that he had some sort of formal training in the Verrocchio workshop between 1469 and 1472. It's been suggested that certain elements that are more naturally observed, more realistically observed, have a kind of higher degree of skill in execution, like the movement of the dog and the fur, or the fish and the way it hangs from the string so convincingly, might be ascribed to the young Leonardo himself. The traditional painting medium in the Renaissance, certainly at the beginning of the 15th century, was egg used mixed with water and pigments and applied in a fine hatched way. The introduction of oil painting is something that happened during the latter part of the 15th century. There were instances of pictures appearing from Northern Europe. I think it had a tremendous impact on the way Italian artists worked, both a need or an interest rather in learning how to paint this way, but also it opened up different ideas about what you could depict and what effects you could make. We can point to certain moments, for example, the arrival of the Van der Goes Portinari altarpiece in Florence from Bruges was a revelation, I think, to Florentine artists working in that time. With Leonardo, it's certainly true that oil painting was a relatively new technique that was available, and it certainly allowed him to explore and to depict things that were interesting to him anyway. The optics of vision and the way that things go in and out of focus, or the way that shadows lose their color in lower light. And all these things, you can achieve much more convincingly, I think, with the oil medium. That certainly was his interest, and it lies at the heart of many of the things he tried to do in paint later in his career.
Leonardo thought that painting should be able to show everything that was visible and everything that was invisible in our universe. And he started that way of thinking by looking very, very closely at the world around him. For example, one of his very earliest drawings shows apparently a view of the Arno Valley. It's dated, it feels like an observation, and yet there are aspects to it which I think most of us would now agree are almost impossible. So the point of his landscapes, the point of his observation of the human figure, is that he's always wanting to move from the specific to the ideal, and from the observed to the imagined.
Probably his earliest independent painting was the Annunciation, which is a long rectangular panel with the standard subject of the angel and the Virgin Mary, but with enormous amount of effort going into it. Leonardo spends a lot of time on the perspective of the Virgin's house, and we know from scientific examination, the wall was initially rather different with the window in a different place. So he's saying, look, I can do perspective. The draperies are done with taking a lay figure with linen, which is then soaked in clay and draped over the figures, giving a very sculptural impression. And above all, he is saying, look what I can do with nature. The carpet of flowers in the enclosed garden, which is symbolic of the Virgin, are absolutely wriggling with life and vitality. And then the angel's wing is based on a bird. You've got this observation of the feathers. The primaries at the end of the wing have deteriorated a lot, so there's rather an offsetting brown smudge. But you look at the rest of the wing, the secondaries, all the other feathers, are painted with this enormous sense of observation. So this young man is saying, look what I can do. I can master all the key things in art.
L'Annunciazione che Leonardo realizza molto presto nella sua carriera è in un certo senso il coronamento di un suo periodo di apprendistato presso la bottega di Verrocchio. Lo possiamo continuare a studiare grazie alle indagini diagnostiche, non soltanto guardare e vedere quindi la realizzazione finale, ma capire anche attraverso quali passi successivi Leonardo arriva a questa composizione. Quali sono anche i suoi cambiamenti, perché non arriva in tutto immediatamente alla realizzazione completa e definitiva. C'è indubbiamente da parte di Leonardo una sorta di sfida con se stesso. Quindi il suo non è tanto un problema di volersi manifestare immediatamente come un artista innovativo, ma ha più che altro il bisogno di confrontarsi con se stesso e quindi di progredire. Ha questo senso del non essere mai appagato da quello che lui sta realizzando. Quindi è più un dialogo di Leonardo con se stesso che non un dialogo con il resto della società artistica del suo tempo.